Well, I'll confess I made a few mistakes this morning already. I'm sure you can abide. A few of them since we started the service. Apparently, I put the wrong text for the sermon in the bulletin, because that's last week, so I forgot to change it. And then I think I gave you the wrong one to begin with. So I may have said 6, which I think is where I'm going to preach out of 5, Deuteronomy chapter 5, and we're looking at the 4th of the 10 Commandments this morning. And so let me just give you a reminder of what Deuteronomy chapter 5 says. I got the verse reference at least right, 12 through 15. But this is the commandment about observing the Sabbath day. And so it says, Moses, in reminding the people of the commandments, he says, "Observe the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. As the Lord your God has commanded you, 6 days shall you labor and do all your work, but on the 7th day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you nor your son or daughter, nor your manservant or your maidservant, nor your ox, your donkey, or any of your animals, nor the alien within your gates, so that your manservant and maidservant may rest as you do. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and that the Lord your God brought you out of there with a mighty hand and with an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God has commanded you to observe the Sabbath day." Have you ever heard the statement, or a variation of it, do you work for your vacation, or do you vacation to get ready for work? Do you work for your vacation, or do you vacation to get ready to go back to work? Or maybe the variation is, do you work to live, or do you live to work? Either of those two positions are really a little bit out of character with what the commandment to remember the Sabbath day, keep it holy, and to rest really has at the heart of it. And the approach that we've been taking towards the 10 Commandments is that the 10 Commandments are really intended to create a community. All of them have the function in the creation of a community of people who are called by God's name and who live out God's purposes within their community. So as we look at them, we're considering how do they create a community together. So we started by looking at commandment number 1, which is, "You shall have no other gods before me." And not that that is God's declaration of ownership, but that is this invitation to the people of Israel that they should create a community, and that God is in the midst of that community and is the utmost focus of their loyalty. God is putting together a community of people in covenant with Him where they have no other gods, no other loyalty that's higher than the loyalty to the Lord their God. And they know, God knows, that they're going to come under all kinds of pressures, military pressures, economic pressures. In order to relieve those pressures, living in this hotbed of the world that they live in, that they're going to be tempted to make alliances. And those alliances are going to put their loyalty to the Lord God to the test. And they're reminded at the very beginning that they are a community, and they're truly only the community they were created to be when their first and only loyalty is to the Lord their God. The second commandment reminds them that they're not supposed to have any images, no images of God. Rather than being a people that have an image of God that they can somehow rally around with the potential to manipulate, move it, interact with it in a way that's on their terms, they're to be an imageless faith, with the recognition that God is always around them. God's always working out His purposes, and if they're to be the community of God, they need to listen. Not just have an image that they direct their prayers to, but they listen and they watch for how God is on the move around them, not in an image that they create. The third commandment is about not misusing the name of God. And again, we looked at it in the sense of community, that they're not supposed to use or misuse the name of God, especially in oaths or in promises, because they're really seeking to manipulate, when they do that, other people to somehow mitigate what they're trying to say or they're trying to do. There's not supposed to be any, I'll do this, so help me God, because God's name is not supposed to be lifted up as a bargaining chip. Instead, they're to deal with one another as a community, revere God's name, and to deal with one another honestly. So here we have this fourth commandment, and it's a commandment to rest. And again, it's a commandment that creates and is intended to create community. It's a recognition at its heart that God creates community, that the people do not create their own way of life. I'll say that again, that God creates community, God's at work. It's not about the people's ability to create their own way of life. So as we've done in the last ones, we want to consider this in three parts. We want to consider, how did this commandment function in Israel, ancient Israel? How did it function, and how does it function for believers? And then what does that mean for us at First Baptist Church here? So first of all, we need to consider, what does it mean for Israel, this commandment to rest? So sometimes you can look at a good example, and sometimes it's helpful to look at a bad example. So I want to look at a bad example first to show how this commandment was not supposed to function in the land of Israel. And this comes from the good old prophet Amos. Love those prophets. They get to stand in their generation and to speak with words of conviction to the people who sometimes got it a little bit wrong. And so in Amos chapter 8 is where Amos begins to challenge people who had got it wrong, especially when it came to this idea of rest. And I apologize because I am sure I did it again. I put down the wrong chapter in my notes. I'm going to have to tell you what it is then, because I have got it wrong, because I know that's not the right chapter I'm supposed to look at. So Amos, wow, it's a good start to the school year. You can see it's going to be a great year for my students. I'm going to bring the wrong syllabus to class. I'm just convinced. Amos challenges them in his book somewhere in it, if I can't put it where it is. And he puts words into their mouth. And their words essentially is, when is the Sabbath going to be over so that we can get back to work? When are the holidays going to be finished so that we can get back to the marketplaces, so that we can market in silver and gold, so that we can cheat the poor out of their goods, so that we can fatten our wallets at their expense? Someone can find where that passage is. That'd be great. You just call it out when you find it. But this is Amos criticizing what has become the norm in the country, that the Sabbath day is seen to them as an inconvenience. It's a day when they have to stop doing what they really want to do. And what they really want to do is make money. And this idea of having to take a day where we don't open our shops, where we don't find our way to more prosperity, that to them was just an exceptionally huge inconvenience. And they wish those days would just pass so they could get back to the business of making money. I wonder if that's where Charles Dickens got his image of Ebenezer Scrooge. Bah humbug. When's that Christmas holiday going to be over so we can open the shop again and back to the business of making money? So Amos criticizes these folks for seeing that the Sabbath to them was an inconvenience. It's become something that stops what they want to do rather than creating the community that God intends for it to be created through this commandment. If we go back to the book of Deuteronomy, you'll notice, if you look through the Ten Commandments, that this one is actually the longest of all of them. It's the longest of any of the commandments. I wonder why this one gets such a long explanation. And I think it's probably because it's the hardest one to swallow. And it's the hardest one to understand. See, this idea of actually taking and stopping for a day their labors and their work, and not only stopping their labors and their work, but they can't hire somebody else to do their work for them so that they can be a good observant Jew and not work while they hire somebody else to do their work for them. They're not even allowed to take the non-Jew, the alien, and get them to work. In fact, they can't even get their animals to do it. The animals get a day off. Why is it so important that the animals get a day of rest? If this is really about creating a community of people, why does God want to create a community of lazy people that take a day off? What is it in this? The key is really verse 15. If you notice verse 15, this is what kind of brings it all together in this long explanation of a commandment. Remember, it says, that you were slaves in Egypt, and that the Lord your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand, with an outstretched arm. Therefore the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day. The Sabbath is not just about taking a day to to rest. The Sabbath day is not about having a day to rest so you can get up the next day and go back to work and feel refreshed. The Sabbath day is about creating an identity as a people, that what happens in the nation of Israel is not by their own efforts, but it's established and it continues by what God does. And they're to have a Sabbath day, a day when they stop, a day when they allow their animals to rest and where they allow the aliens in their midst to rest, to show that their life does not fall apart because they stop working. Because God is the one who's working. God is the one who established the pattern. And God works and is at work even when you and I take a day off and take a time off. Because it's really about establishing God's purposes and not the bank accounts of the people of Israel. The clearest proof of that would be looking at an example from one of the books, 2 Kings. In the book of 2 Kings, 1st and 2 Kings, it's a list of all the kings that reigned over Israel. Right? So you start from King Saul and Samuel, and then King David, and then King Solomon, and then it goes through, and it kind of chronologically follows all of the kings that reigned over Israel and reigned over Judah. And as it does, it kind of describes what they do, and then it gives a judgment about them, whether they're a good king or a bad king. To me, one of the most illustrative kings is Jeroboam II. There are actually two kings named Jeroboam, but this is Jeroboam II. It's found in if you can trust my reference that I wrote down here, 2 Kings chapter 14. It talks about his life. So here's a king who reigned 41 years. 41 years. That is a long time. Amongst Israel's kings, that is a long time. David reigned 40 years. Solomon reigned 40 years. Very few kings got to reign 40 years. And Jeroboam II was a fantastic military leader. Jeroboam II was a fantastic foreign negotiator. Jeroboam II was a fantastic economic leader for his time. He pushed Israel's borders to the greatest they had been since the time of King David. He was restoring the golden age of this kingdom. King David gets a book and a half to describe his exploits. Solomon, who reigned 40 years, gets 11 chapters to describe his exploits. Jeroboam II, who reigned 41 years, gets 7 verses. And in those 7 verses, it pretty much says the only reason Jeroboam was allowed to do what he did is because God was trying to restore the fortunes of his people that had gone astray. But Jeroboam II was a bad king. He did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and he's only worth a footnote in history. 7 verses for 41 years. And the writer of 2 Kings is describing this because it doesn't matter whether you're a fantastic economic leader. And it doesn't matter whether you got the military at the height of its power. It doesn't matter if you push the borders and you do all the right things that kings are supposed to do. If you don't establish the identity of God's people as being God's people, you're a bad king no matter what you do. Because it's about identity. I'm pretty sure Jeroboam II didn't have time for the Sabbath. He was too busy building a kingdom. But what the Sabbath does for the people of Israel is it establishes their identity as a people that recognize that God works, God does this, and when they get up, they are just responding and joining into what God has been doing the whole time. Because it's God's people, not their ability. And that's to be their identity. You know, as you move away from the time when Israel got its own land, its own country, and they began to get taken over by others because of their sin, and they ended up having to live out their life in other places besides Israel, where Roman culture and Greek culture and Persian culture, they didn't observe Sabbath days. As they began to try to continue to keep their Sabbath, they looked weird to everybody. We find in the writings of the Roman authors that they used to think that these Jewish people were lazy because they always took a day off every week. Why not keep the shops open? And one of the things that they sought to do is they tried to keep their identity is to continue to observe the Sabbath day because it marked them off. I mean, the males were all circumcised, but that wasn't something the community ever saw. But they saw that they took a day off every week. And they did that because they were a peculiar people, a unique people, and they were establishing their identity. Well, we're not the ancient Israelite people. And we now read these commandments in the aftermath of Jesus Christ coming into the world, teaching about the kingdom of God, crucified on the cross, raised again from the dead. How does that begin to influence our community of faith together? It's not like the early Christians who were living in Greek and Roman culture primarily. They weren't able to take a day off. If we know anything about the rise of Christianity, it primarily happened amongst the working class and the lower class, the slaves. The slave could not go to his master hat in hand and said, "Sir, I've become a follower of this resurrected Jewish man, and we're supposed to take a day off, so could I please have every Sabbath day off?" That wasn't going to work. They needed a different way to establish their identity. In fact, so much so that when Paul, who often wrote to these churches filled with people who were part of a Greek culture or a Roman culture, when he wrote to the church at Colossae, this is what he said to the slaves. He didn't say demand a day off so you can rest. He said this, "Bondservants, obey in everything those who are your earthly masters, not in the way of eye service, as people pleasers, but with sincerity of heart, fearing the Lord. Whatever you do, work heartily, as for the Lord and not for men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive an inheritance as your reward. You are serving the Lord Christ. For the wrongdoer will be paid back for everything wrong he has done." There's no partiality. So they were commanded not to have a day of rest, but they were to work all the harder, and whatever their master told them to do, that was to be their identity. Because they saw themselves as being in Christ, when they approached their job, even their bondservanthood, they were to approach it with a new vigor, a new attitude, because they were no longer serving their earthly master, but they were serving the Lord Christ. You know, believers have had discussions a long time over what this rest commandment means for believers. When I was a pastor in St. John, we still had, this was back in the 90s, up into the early 2000s, in that city that I pastored in, we still had Sunday as a day of no shopping. It was supposed to be a rest day. Most stores were closed. The only thing that was allowed to be open were pharmacies and tourism things, because we had a lot of tourists come in, and if they came in on Sunday, they needed something to do, so they had some touristy sites. It was only during my time of pastoring there that the city council passed laws and the province passed a law that would allow shops to stay open between noon on Sunday and 5 o'clock. That was their borders. They could be open that day. But you know, in that whole discussion, it wasn't because we were there's no discussion that the reason the shops were closed was because we were trying to proclaim our Christian identity. It was just the culture that had done that for a long, long time. St. John had long before ceased to be any kind of Christian bastion of faith. And so it became a community type of activity. It's interesting to me that the Jewish leaders, the very earliest Christians, when they were trying to decide what's going to set apart someone who's a follower of Jesus from someone who's not a follower of Jesus, when they made that decision, the Sabbath command was not on the radar. That is not one that they gave to say, this is what sets aside a believer from a non-believer. In Acts chapter 15, they actually write a letter to all the churches, the non-Jewish churches, to try to establish what does it mean to be a believer? What am I supposed to stand for? Am I supposed to stand for the whole Jewish laws at the Ten Commandments? In fact, what they give to them, this advice from the leaders in the church, they say, I want you to do these 4 things. 1, abstain from what's been sacrificed to idols. 2, abstain from blood, especially eating meat that still has the blood in it, which was associated with certain worship of idols. Abstain from things that have been strangled, which again was associated with the worship of idols. And then 3, abstain from sexual immorality. Because in a culture like the Greek and Roman culture that was rampant with sexual immorality, if you want to stand out, don't participate in those things and see how quickly you establish your identity. And so those are the 4 things that the believers were asked to stand for. It wasn't so much taking a day of rest. That was a particularly Jewish thing that established their identity. The Christians had to learn, how do we establish our own identity? What is it that we are going to stand for? How are we going to be known as the people who follow Jesus. And so believers have done that in various ways. Sometimes it is a group of people saying, no, this is we're going to establish it by having a day of rest. And you know that Seventh-day Adventists, for instance, they very, very strict on following the Saturday as their Sabbath, and they don't do any work on it. It's been popularized in a movie, if you like war movies, called Hacksaw Ridge. But what is it that establishes our identity as believers? Sadly, when I get to this part, what does this mean for FBC? It's blank. Because what is it? What is it that we want to be known for? That when people think that these are followers of Jesus, and at First Baptist Church, when I think of First Baptist Church, I think of this. What's the this that they think of? The earliest church, as they wrestled with their identity, again, it was not being identified with idol worship. It was being identified with sexual purity. What is it in our generation that gives us that identity, that sets us apart and lets people know that when they think of us as followers of Jesus Christ, it means this? And that ongoing work of establishing identity is something that we need to continue to do. That's probably why I left that part of it blank. What is it that establishes us and shows that we are followers of Jesus Christ? That's a conversation that I think our leaders, our deacons, CLC, and the way that they lead community, we still need to have that conversation. What is it that First Baptist Church is known for? Put on the other way, what do we want ourselves to be known for? May God give us wisdom as we have that conversation together. Where is our identity as followers of Jesus?